Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, or good morning, depending on your time zone. I hope you're keeping well and staying safe. Welcome to this Geoscience BC and Geological Survey of Canada open house to discuss the 29 fieldwork findings from the Garibaldi Geothermal Volcanic Belt Assessment Project. My name is Richard Truman. I'm the Director of External Relations at Geoscience BC, and I'll be your MC for this afternoon. Joining us today are Geoscience BC Chief Scientific Officer and Executive Vice President, and also Geological Survey of Canada Research Scientist, Dr. Steve Grasby. Carlos will provide a short introduction to Geoscience BC, to geothermal, and to this project before handing over to Steve, who will talk you through the detail of the 2019 fieldwork. Joining us in the background is Candice Appleby. Candice is from Geoscience BC, and she's making all of the technical wizardry in the background happen, which I'll give you some detail on in a second. If we seem a little bit nervous or maybe a little bit excited or perhaps a little bit of both this afternoon, then please bear with us. We expected maybe 40 people, something like that, for this open house meeting, and we have more than 130 people registered, and I see 83 people online already, and more people joining every second. So it's really exciting for us, and thank you to everybody for joining us. We're really pleased to see so many people keen to hear more about the geothermal research that's happening at Mount Meager and in the Garibaldi Volcanic Belt in southern British Columbia. There's a few people I'd particularly like to acknowledge that I understand are with us this afternoon. First of all, the local member of the Legislative Assembly, Jordan Sturdy. Also a long-time Geoscience BC volunteer and the chair of our Geothermal Technical Advisory Committee, Dr. Kathy Hickson, and also members of the Lil'wat and Squamish First Nations who have taken a really keen interest in this project so far. So before I hand you over to Carlos and to Steve, a few quick notes on how we'll run things this afternoon. You'll hear from Carlos and you'll hear from Steve, and then we'll have some time for questions before we finish, and we'll finish at around 4 o'clock. We're conducting this open house in Zoom, but the meeting is also being live streamed on YouTube. And after the meeting, the video from the meet will also be uploaded to YouTube. We will take questions on Zoom, but you won't be able to ask questions on YouTube. So if you're watching this live on YouTube, I'm afraid you won't be able to ask questions this afternoon live. To keep things simple and to keep things reliable, your microphones and your video are switched off by default for most of this session, and we ask you to keep them that way for most of the session. Like I said, there's plenty of time at the end for questions. And you can ask questions in the chat function, or you can use Zoom's raise hand feature to do that. And when you do that, we'll turn on your camera and your microphone during the question period. To keep the risk of any interruptions or Zoom bombing to a minimum, we do reserve the right to remove people from the open house. And just now, as we're getting started, what we're also going to be doing is locking the room as well, which will prevent new people from joining. If they're late joining, they can still watch us on YouTube live. That's pretty much it from me for now. So I'm going to hand you over to Carlos Salas to talk about Geoscience BC, about geothermal, and about this project. So good afternoon, Carlos. I see you've just unmuted yourself. Over to you. I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, Rich, let's see if technology works. Can you see my screen?
We can see your screen. Thank you. Yeah.
Hallelujah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Rich, for the introduction. I'm Carlos Salas. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer here at Geoscience BC. And without any further ado, let's get on with our webinar. But before that, just like any YouTube streaming thing you're watching or Netflix or anything, there's a commercial beforehand. And this is it. A little bit about ourselves. We are a nonprofit, publicly funded organization, and we enable informed decision-making and responsible economic development through public earth science. And if you want to know more about us, please do visit our website at geosciencebc.com. So, what is geothermal energy? And I'm going to be talking in pretty broad terms, so it probably will drive the experts wacky, but I'm going to be using pretty simplistic terms in generally speaking. All right, so there's two ways that geothermal energy is created. The Earth has certain minerals which contain radioactive elements such as uranium, potassium, and thorium. And what happens is that these radioactive elements decay and heat is released. And then that heat can be measured by scientists on the surface of the Earth, and it will vary depending where you are on the surface of the Earth. Now, the other way that the Earth can generate heat at the surface is through magnetism due to plate tectonics. So let me explain what that means. Back in the early 1960s, geoscientists such as University of Toronto's Tuzo Wilson and many others proposed a theory of plate tectonics to explain what they were seeing in current physical processes, especially along mid-ocean ridges like there. Hopefully you can see my pointer. And trying to tie this back to the rock record. So what was happening is hot magma was coming out of from the mantle at these mid-ocean ridges and creating oceanic crust, this over there. And slowly, as this crust cools, it starts to sink underneath the continents. Now, the continents, their rock makeup is much less dense than these oceanic rocks. So in essence, the continents float over these oceanic crust rocks, no different than over water. It's hard to believe, but yes, you can have rocks floating on top of other rocks. Now, as the heavier and cooler oceanic crust sinks, it heats up and eventually melts. Now, this hot magma then floats back up and is manifested at the surface as volcanoes along the margins of continents. And for example, the whole Circum-Pacific belt is ringed with volcanoes. And these are areas of higher increased heat flow. Now, so being along the Circum-Pacific belt, BC is no exception. And here's a map of the lower mainland, and you can see over 24 or so volcanoes, those little yellow dots, over what we call the Garibaldi volcanic belt. And today we're going to be talking about Mount Meager and the research that's currently going on with the Geological Survey of Canada. And if you didn't know, Mount Meager is Canada's only active volcano. Now, Geoscience BC first became interested in geothermal energy back in 2012. And our first project was done by Kerwood Liddell and Geothermics. And they were looking at a high-level provincial assessment of the economic viability of 16 selected geothermal resources throughout British Columbia. And not surprisingly, Mount Meager ranked first. Now, I'll quickly just go over this little map here. The hotter the colors, the pink is the highest heat flow areas, and you'll see, and the cool colors, the blues, are the low heat flow areas. And you can see areas such as the Mount Meager area, the Garibaldi volcanic belt, pink, very high heat flow. Areas in northwest British Columbia, Mount Edziza, etc., high heat flow, and also in the Kootenays, another area of high heat flow. Now, the next project that we followed that up on was a compilation of all the data that existed around Mount Meager, that Garibaldi area, and public data. So any data, any research that had been done in that area, we compiled it and we put it on our website so that anybody that wanted to do research or wanted to do exploration, better yet, around that area could do one. And lastly, the last project that we have on our website is one which was created not too long ago by Dr. Jeff Witter, and it's a white paper that's called New Perspectives from Recently Unearthed Data. And what he comes up with is he went through all the data, and to him, it appeared that you actually could map out high permeability zones in that area, and the general consensus beforehand was that Mount Meager didn't really go forward because it didn't have permeability. Well, there's new theories that say that's probably not correct. So with that in hand, our next step was to understand technically what was happening in the subsurface of Mount Meager. So in essence, we wanted to lay the foundation for further work and the assessment of the geothermal potential for that region. And that's where we teamed up with the Geological Survey of Canada and 7 universities to do additional work in that area. And now I will pass the baton on to Dr. Steve Grasby.
Hi there. I'll just get my screen going here. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks everyone for tuning in today on the webinar, and the goal is to give you an overview of our 2019 field campaign and the work we did at in and around Mount Meager as part of our assessment of geothermal resource potential, the Garibaldi volcanic belt. First of all, I wanted to just start with some thank yous for everything that came into helping this field program go ahead, starting with the Squamish and Lil'wat First Nations, who welcome us onto their traditional lands, as well as just the support they've given for our research programs and goals and helping us in planning. Particularly, I'd like to thank Maxine Bruce, who was instrumental in helping us pick the appropriate spots for different survey sites and helping us with the field plans. And then Tammy Jenkin, who from Lil'wat First Nations, who is our wildlife monitor. So she kept us safe in the field, but also brought a lot of good cheer and joy to the field camp. Of course, we'd like to recognize Geoscience BC and NRCan's Emerging Renewable Power Program that's funded the work that has been done and is still ongoing. I'd like to say special thanks to Interjex Renewable Energy. They allowed us to use their bunkhouse at the Mount Meager area, which really enabled our field program. And we really like to recognize the excellent skills of the pilots of No Limit helicopters that brought us safely all over the Mount Meager area and back home at the end of the day. And just from a personal level, I'd like to recognize and thank the research team, who are just really a fabulous group of people that showed just really high level of enthusiasm for this program. And I really enjoyed the ability to work with them this summer, or last summer. So as Carlos alluded to, there's abundant volcanic belts and volcanoes in Canada. And as a general perspective, we were interested in looking at geothermal potential across the country. And part of the reason for that is that it's a renewable energy resource. And compared to other resources such as solar power or wind power, geothermal has the advantage of its base load power supply. So that means that it's always there when you need it. So, of course, everybody realizes that wind only works when it's windy and solar only works when the sun is out. So geothermal is that reliable power source that people would like. So it occurs in many different geologic settings across the country, but this study is focused on the potential volcanic belts. And of course, it's obvious that volcanoes are a high temperature place to look for hot resources. And we focused on the Garibaldi belt, partly from the previous work, as Carlos had mentioned. It shows a high potential in Canada, and also it's close to the low demand or the high population belts of southwestern British Columbia. So there are these volcanoes across Western Canada, and unfortunately, I guess most of them have been dormant for the last 12,000 years or so. But as Carlos said, the Mount Meager is the only active volcano in the country, and it's last erupted about 2,400 years ago. It has been the focus of much geothermal research in the past, even back into the 1970s when the first geothermal program in the federal government was started. There was research by the Geological Survey of Canada and BC Hydro that did a combined research program at Mount Meager. This included drilling some research wells. And since that time, there's also been subsequent industry exploration. So there's been a number of wells drilled on the site and a lot of research done. So this is, and that work really defined a world-class thermal resource that he discovered at fairly shallow depths, rocks at over 250 degrees Celsius. So these are very high temperature resources and very attractive from a geothermal point of view. But as people know, there's no geothermal plant there today. And part of the reason for that is the lack of permeability. And that's just a term we use to describe the ability of water to move through rocks. So to make geothermal work, you need the hot rocks, but you need a way to get that heat to surface. And the way that's done is by producing the water from the rocks. You extract the water, you pump it to surface, you take the heat out to generate electricity, and then re-inject the water back into the rocks again. So having just the high temperatures isn't enough. You need this permeability as well. So we decided to focus our look at Mount Meager because really the limiting aspect of geothermal in many ways is the ability to find these high permeability rocks at depth. It's very expensive to drill a well, so you can't just sort of go randomly drilling all over the place trying to hope to find a permeable zone. And it's also not that, it's not that ideal in many ways. So what our research is focused on is, are there ways that we can, with a low impact and relatively low cost, see into the depth to image and predict where these permeable zones are in regions that we know are high temperature, and that can help focus the exploration efforts and to reduce the risk of drilling an expensive well and not finding that permeability that's needed. So to do this, we pulled together the Mount Meager team. So this includes researchers from the Geological Survey of Canada, plus 7 universities. That's including University of British Columbia, Simon & Fraser University, Douglas College, University of Alberta, University of Calgary, ETH out of Switzerland, and Quest University. In total, we had 34 people in the field. This wasn't all at one time, but over the course of the summer. But in total, that was 375 person days spent in the field last summer. And a big portion of our field campaign and our research was training the next generation of geoscientists and geothermal experts. So we had 3 postdoctoral fellows, 6 PhD students, 1 master's student, and 1 bachelor student whose research projects are all going to be components of this overall Mount Meager research. This just gives a sense of what our field camp looked like. So that's the bunkhouse from Intergex. So even at the end of the day, after a hard day in the field team are working on their computers and downloading all the data they've collected and putting it into the computers to keep it safe. The bunkhouse we used for just for our washroom facilities and cleaning and cooking, but there's only 2 bedrooms there. So we had one for the pilot and one for the wildlife monitor. And the research team stayed in the tents that you can see that were just on the gravel pad right in front of the bunkhouse. So those tents are just right in front of the deck that you see here. So what we did last summer is we basically focused on studying and mapping the rocks around Mount Meager and using a series of different techniques, passive geophysical methods, to try to see into the mountain. And I mentioned passive here because the geophysics sometimes is associated with what's called active measures, or you're doing things like exploding dynamite to try to send shockwaves through the earth and measuring how those respond to the surface. But our focus is on a passive method, so we're just using natural earth sources to understand the rocks in the subsurface. So there's a whole series of different things we employed here. We have passive seismic and what we just refer to as a deep magnetotellurics and shallow magnetotellurics, gravity surveys, fracture study, hot spring geochemistry, and bedrock mapping. So for all this work, these are the types of things we did last summer. We've collected a tremendous amount of data, well over 2 terabytes of new data that was collected. And this is all the focus of these different research projects of students and the researchers involved. So today we don't have a lot of new conclusions yet to present because it's still being studied and analyzed. But what my goal is just to give an overview of the nature of the work we did last summer and the type of data we collected, and to give a sense of where we're at currently in the overall program. So where we went, there's just a map of the Mount Meager area. Mount Meager is just kind of right in the center here. There's the Lillooet River coming down that way and Meager Creek down this way. All the dots represent places that we've gone to. So over 1,000 different places that we stopped. And you can see that we're kind of going all around the mountain. We have kind of a course area here. This is the Upper Lillooet Provincial Park. We did intend to do some measurements within this area so we can kind of see all around Mount Meager, but our permitting started a little late, and then we didn't get the final approval till towards the end of the field season. So we ended up with a little bit blank area here. So most of our work is focused kind of wrapping around the Mount Meager outside the park boundary. To access sites, again, we use the services of No Limit helicopters to bring us to many of the high ridges and all over the mountains, but even helicopters can't get you everywhere. So we also had a lot of days of people just carrying heavy backpacks full of geophysics equipment through the forests and trees and lugging around through the mountains there. So just to give an overview then of the nature of the work that was being done, we had these passive seismic stations. So these are just, so you can see here, there's my foot for scale. And then this is what the seismometer looks like. So it's quite small. It's just left on the ground for about 2 months. And this just records shaking of the ground from things like minor earthquakes, too minor for people to feel, but the equipment can detect it. Sensitive enough that it can also detect rock falls. And as I found out later, that it does indeed detect people jumping up and down beside the sensor. The little wave here, this shows the nature of the vibrations that the equipment detects. So that's like a little earthquake, and it's causing the ground to shake, which is represented by this wave going up and down. So they're referred to as seismic waves. And because the seismic wave energy moves at different speeds through different rock types or solids or liquids, it can also reflect just like a wave would reflect off of a beach. It can reflect off of contrast in rock types. And the collection of all this data gives them this potential to image the major faults, and even if there's a potential magma chamber still under the mountain, as well as geothermal reservoirs under the mountain. We had work being done on magnetotellurics, and this is kind of similar to the passive seismic, but instead of measuring energy waves moving through the earth, you're measuring magnetic and electrical waves that move through the earth. The sources of these might be solar flares from the sun, or even a thunderstorm on the other side of the planet. And then those magnetic and electric waves move through the earth, and they can be detected through the instruments that are laid out here in the photograph. And then they can measure the contrast and the activity of electricity through the rock, and that allows them to produce a subsurface image. This is just an example here of what was done. So all the dots represent the different stations where they recorded data. And from that data, this is, you can imagine if you were looking straight down at the earth at 4.5 kilometers depth, this is the map of the difference in resistivity of the rocks. So that's just the opposite of connectivity. And then, so the red regions are more resistive to electrical flow, and the blue are the least resistive. So things like hot waters or even like partially melted rocks can give you these red colors. So they get a series of these slices, and you can stack them all together from different depths, and it allows them to generate this kind of three-dimensional model. And that's just a picture here. So you can see this big red blob of some kind of very resistive material right underneath Mount Meager. So this could be a geothermal reservoir, or it could be some partly melted rock. That's still the focus of research, to understand what might be causing that, kind of large resistive blob, what that is. We also have just what I've termed shallow magnetotellurics. It's really the same technique as the deep one, but in this case, you can imagine just with a camera, as you can change the focal length to focus farther away or closer up. It's the same concept here. So with these techniques, you can have your instrument spread far out and record your data differently, so you can focus deeper into the earth, or you can change the focus so you can see shallower. So here the black dots are all the locations they went, and there's Mount Meager, the Lillooet River here, and Meager Creek. So this survey was very much focused around the area where previous drilling and exploration has occurred for geothermal energy on Mount Meager on that south flank. This is just some of the team members at work. So we discovered if they carry 2 bags at once, then you only need half the number of people doing the work. Then again, they were just doing a series of depth slices where you can see the difference in resistivity of the material and the subsurface, and you get these bright red, high resistive zones that again are potential geothermal reservoirs. It's the type of thing that we're looking for, but we don't yet know that's the case. But this is where we would want to focus further study and research to better understand what's giving us these bright red zones. Is it something that's interesting from an exploration point of view or not? There's also work done on gravity surveys. So this is just a technique to just measure minute changes in the Earth's gravity due to density difference in rocks and fluids in the subsurface. And that's just the map here of how the gravity varies around the Mount Meager area. Again, the black dots are all the stations. So that's the Little Wet River and Meager Creek. And then all these dots are where gravity measurements are taken. And the colors just represent small variations in gravity as you go around the mountain. And this work is focusing then can we relate these variations in gravity to what we see in the magnetotellurics data or the seismic data, and this will all be integrated to get this better understanding of what's underneath Mount Meager. We had a team of 2 guys that were doing the geological mapping of the area too, and this is just to bring the ground truth of the rock types and how they vary over the study area. They're creating these nice colorful maps showing the geology of Mount Meager. You can see these guys are very busy. They went to about 903 sites over the summer to make observations of the rock types. And they're also the not just hardworking, but they're only part of the team that didn't have access to the helicopter every day. So we just dropped them off. They set up a little 2-person camp up in the mountains and did most of their work just by hard, long days of hiking up and down hills and to look at rocks along the way. Not just mapping the rocks, but also doing a lot of focus study on defining where the faults and fractures are in the rocks. And this is very important because if you have breaks in the rocks, faults and fractures, that can help to get this higher fluid flow or permeability that we're looking for as a geothermal reservoir. Along with that, we had some focused study just on the fracture system. So a couple of the team members here just doing detailed measurements of the orientations of the fractures and the density and spacing of fractures. And that just helps us predict in what directions would you most likely see fracture systems. So here is just sort of kind of like a map of the compass, so north, south, east, and west. And then these color blue bars just represent the fracture orientations. And then the farther the bar goes out means the higher number of fractures in that particular orientation. So it gives you a sense that there's a lot of fractures in that direction, which then can help you with planning reservoir development and drilling. These guys are also quite busy. They took over 1,500 measurements over the course of the summer. There's been some work was done on the hot spring geochemistry. So this is just pure sampling of the hot springs and measuring the water and the temperature of the springs. And we can use a lot of different techniques to understand the chemistry that can give us a assessment and information on the nature of the geothermal reservoir and the subsurface that's creating the hot springs that we see at surface in the Mount Meager area. So that's kind of the focus of what was done on the field, but to parallel with that, we did a bit of work remotely. So there's remote sensing data. So in this case, we looked at satellite images to look for thermal anomalies and can they be related to fracture systems, and can that help predict where the geothermal fluids will be flowing in the subsurface. So you can take a raw image. From that, you can extract from the infrared bands, the color bands of the image, thermal anomalies. So all these bright colors. There's Mount Meager again, and in this area, that's the same image, but the bright colors represent these hotter parts of the image. So it suggests there's, the ground is warmer in these areas than the blue areas. And we can take that and we can do something referred to as liniment extraction. So it's just looking at kind of linear features that generate these warm colors. So you can see you get all these kind of very straight lines across the landscape. And what this most likely represents is fractures and faults across the mountain region that is focusing some warmer fluid flow and heat conduction to surface. So this can help us better model, again, where you might drill to find these higher permeability rocks in the deeper hot zones. So all of this work we're going to be combining together to develop a resource model, to kind of develop a mathematical model of the geothermal resource in the area. I asked the people to give me just the basics. So they said they'll send the basics of the physics equations for modeling, and they sent me this. So I think that's a little bit more complex than I was hoping for, but for some people, this will explain it all. Just as a little simpler version, I can show you sort of what they're doing is creating a mathematical model of the Mount Meager area, and this idea that if you're drilling into the subsurface and using all the constraints that we collected over the summer in terms of the rock types and fracture systems and geophysical data, and to say if we drilled into one of these kind of warm, hot zones where we predict there's lots of fractures, and then you pump that water out through an outlet well, then again, we're just using the water to pump the heat from the subsurface to the surface, where we can extract it and use the heat to generate electricity that cools the water, and we just inject that back into the subsurface. So it's a closed loop system. This helps maintain the pressure of the water in the geothermal reservoir, but it also avoids any kind of environmental concerns about producing waters at surface, because it's a closed loop system. So everything you produce just gets re-injected back into the ground. And so just from their first modeling, they're suggesting that one well in this area, if you had the right permeability from the fracture models and all the geophysical data we combined, that we could maybe expect 6 to 13 megawatts power produced from a well for producing for over 30 years. At some point in time, you might cool off the reservoir at one well, but then this is just a model for a single well. And then, of course, you can look at multiple wells that would increase the total power. I would just emphasize this is very preliminary results, and we are going to be integrating all the research data as it comes along into the overall study. So this is going to be modified. So this is just the first kick of the can. And we'll have a much more refined understanding and predictions of the type of geothermal power that would have potential in this region. So that kind of summarizes most of what we did, but we also got some bonus science in. It's always nice to get a little added science into a research study. But in this area in particular, because although our focus was for the geothermal energy potential of the region, we recognize that there's also a lot of community concerns and broader concerns for aspects of landslide hazards and volcanic hazards in the region. So we integrated with people working on these topics. Some of the people in our geothermal study group are also working on these hazards studies as well. So they're well integrated into our effort, and we're also actively talking to the people who are working on these aspects that weren't directly involved in our summer's research program. So our goal is to make sure that all the data that we can collect, which is useful for the geothermal model, but is also very helpful and useful for people looking at these hazards or other aspects, that we're trying to make sure that they're well aware and integrated in everything we do, so that our data we could collect has a much broader impact than just the geothermal resource assessment. So the results to date, we have an initial report online at Geoscience BC, so you can look at the links that Richard has put up. This gives a summary of everything we did last summer and an overview of the results to date, and also links to all the team members and their affiliations if you want to see who's involved. And then what's next? Well, there's going to be ongoing data interpretation. All the students are busy working on their thesis research. There's science papers being written and in progress. And all the data that we've collected last summer will be publicly released in 2021. And we have a 1-year delay that we put in here, and this solely just to really give the students a chance to have an opportunity to have first use of the data they've collected for their own research, for their PhD and master's projects. And then they get sort of a 1-year proprietary use of that data, but then after that point, it's going to be made completely publicly available and online through Geoscience BC as well as through the Geological Survey of Canada. And we'll be doing more public outreach such as this, and in the future giving more definitive results of our findings, whereas today is just more of an overview of what we did last summer. And one other thing we would like to mention today is that I said at the beginning we had that kind of hole in the park where we weren't able to, we didn't have our research permits lined up in time to get in areas the Lillooet Provincial Park. We do have that research permit now, but of course we have the reason why we're all online here and not in a meeting room is because of the COVID concern. So we do have the wish and desire to fill that hole in the park area, to go back this summer to fill in some of these gaps. But that's, with the full knowledge as only if it's possible and considered safe by government bodies that are, regulating the current conditions in BC, and also only through consultations with the Indigenous groups and local communities, because we don't want to go into the region if anyone feels it's at all unsafe for them to have some outsiders show up. So we'll, if at all possible, we would love to get back, but only if everyone thinks it's safe and okay for them. We would look at that in maybe, late August, and it will certainly come and talk to the Indigenous people and local communities more directly, just if that at all looks at all possible at this stage. It's just too many uncertainties, but we just want to make sure people are aware of what our hopes and wishes are at this stage. So just end with that. We're open for questions and happy to answer any questions. So I'm here myself, and we also have some of the other key researchers that are involved in the group on the line, that if I get stuck on a tough question, we can call a friend and they can pipe up and give a answer as well. So pass it on to Richard with that.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Carlos. There was a lot of information there, I know, but I know also when we were talking before this meeting, you were saying that there's lots of technical information that you'd love to share, and we've got lots of technical experts, I know, joining us here today. Just a quick note, Steve mentioned that the current report is on the Geoscience BC website, and you'll all get an email with a link to that after today as well to have a look as well. I see, Steve, you still have your camera and your microphone on. I see Carlos is back with his camera and microphone on. I see Dr. Kathy Hickson has joined as well. And Kathy, you mentioned earlier that you had a quick question for the team.
Oh, yes. Great updates to you. Fantastic work, and see all of this new stuff happening in the Garibaldi area. So my question was one of those kind of bonus science. I mean, we have a number of wide bore wells that have been drilled there. Any thinking in terms of making that into a geothermal test site, or relogging those wells, or using them in some way? Because certainly a significant amount of money has been spent drilling them. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Certainly, that's a good question and great point. They're valuable resources in a sense, right? And we just need to be sure that for any particular well that, well, first of all, there's a well owner that's okay for whoever owns the well. But then also you have to just ensure that there's no potential, issues with re-entering wells. So I know some are open and easy to access, and others are under pressure and much more difficult. So we would like to certainly use those opportunities to look at those wells and more, but I think we just have to do an initial evaluation just to ensure which ones are suitable to enter and which ones we probably best to avoid.
Okay, hopefully that answers your question, Kathy. And then just sort of going through some of the questions that we had on the chat, I noticed that Ruben Arellano, I think you were first up with the next question. Are you, if you can turn your microphone and your video off, Ruben, are you able to ask the question? Okay, I'll take that as a no. So let me go back and find Ruben's question. Hey, Ruben. Sorry.
Hi, sorry about that. I was double muted here. Had to fix that up. Yeah, no, I guess just my question. I mean, you and I know it's early days. You presented a lot of sort of new data and different methods that you utilize in the program, and I'm just wondering if you've got a sense of which of those methods or data that you collected might be the most sort of promising or revelatory new info. Was there something that made you go, oh, that's worth looking at, that was distinctive? Just a question.
Yeah, I mean, I think partly all my different research groups are online here, so I have to be careful I don't pick favorites. But at the same time, I think what's unique about this project, and it has been highlighted that way in the geophysical community, is just this process of actually trying to use a broad spectrum of different techniques and to integrate the data. So at this stage, what we're looking forward to is this integrated approach where we get the best elements of all the different methods and to see what that final picture gives us. And that's a stage which we haven't reached yet. So I guess I'm maybe hesitant to say there's one thing that is more promising than the next, because what we really hope for is this integration of everything as giving us this new unique insight into imaging the subsurface.
Yeah, Steve, I'd like to add also that same concept, that being able to use programs like Leapfrog to model everything afterwards is going to be really helpful, I think.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, does that answer your question, Ruben?
Sort of. I get where he's coming from. He doesn't want to pick favorites among the family, but yeah, no, I appreciate the answer, and yeah, it's an interesting approach for sure. So I understand. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Ruben. And up next, we had a few questions come through on the chat from Kathleen Dory. Kathleen, are you able to turn your microphone and your camera on to ask the questions that you had?
Just a sec. I've got my. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear
you.
Okay,
I'll turn the camera on here shortly. Thanks. Great talk. Thank you very much. So I had a few questions. One was, what would be the cost of a well there? In your schematic, you had it at about, depending on where your source is, of course, but you had it at about 3,000 meters.
Well, I think in that one image was the deep magnetotellurics. They're imaging down to about 10 kilometers even. But the previous drilling that's been done, they were defining 250-degree waters at a depth of a kilometer to a kilometer and a half. So they're not very deep wells, and that's what makes this an attractive area, is that it's relatively shallow, high temperature resources. I'm not aware off the top of my head. I mean, people have drilled wells. There's about 6 or 7 wells drilled there, and I'm not aware off the top of my head what those drilling costs were. But I would believe it's in that compilation of data that Carlos mentioned for the meager area. So all the previous research that was done by the Geological Survey, BC Hydro, as well as industry, has been compiled by Geoscience BC and is available online. So there's a lot of really valuable information that gives that insight.
Yeah,
okay.
Kathleen, in that provincial assessment for geothermal value by KWL and geothermics, in the appendix, you'll be able to find what input parameters we put in there for the cost of the wells.
Okay, thank you. And the wells that are already there, are some of them as deep as a kilometer or even deeper? Do you know? Or
yes, yeah. I think they drilled as far as like 1.5 kilometers.
Okay, thank you. The other question I had was the remote sensing. Was that newly acquired, or some of it was from an existing public database? Or
it was existing public data that was been accessed.
Okay. Okay, and I had another question about the power grid, but that one was already answered by a few people, so thank you.
All right.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. Was there anything else you wanted to ask?
No, that's it for now. Thank you. It's a great talk.
Okay, thank you. So next up, we had a few questions, I think, also from Ron Monk. Ron, are you able to turn your camera and your microphone on?
I believe I have both on. Can people hear me?
Yep,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
So first of all, thank you very much for a very interesting talk on the recent investigations. I was involved in, I led the Kerwood-Lytle geothermics report that was referenced from 2015 with geothermics doing the main part of the geothermal assessment, and Kerwood-Lytle really did the economics and environmental and social. My question, and maybe it's a question to myself, it'd be interesting to know what the updated cost per megawatt hour would be for developments at Meager Mountain now that there's more information on the resource. So that was basically my question. And at the time that we did the study, that was, this resource was interesting, the best geothermal resource that we looked at in British Columbia, in part because it's the most investigated. So that's kind of an unfair race. But I think it would be interesting to update the economics for a couple of reasons. There's been innovation in drilling that may have driven the cost down. If there's information on better resource, of course, that will make the resource more economic. And just on the power line, I sort of answered the question in the chat, but there is a 230 kV power line nearby that belongs to Intergex. It goes from their Upper Lillooet hydro plant and connects to the BC Hydro system between Pemberton and Whistler. An arrangement would need to be made with Intergex to use that line. And obviously a market would need to exist where BC Hydro would actually buy the power. But this is an interesting option for the future. And I see that Alex Tu is on the line, and he's responsible for resource options at BC Hydro. He may have comments on that. And on the cost of drilling, I noticed that there's folks from Geothermics on the line, and they may be able to have comments on the drilling. And I'm sure that there's others on the line that would be able to comment on the drilling costs.
Yeah, I think those are all really great comments, and certainly, we want to look at those, revised estimates for economics in the future. That being said, I mean, our focus of going, to Meager itself wasn't necessarily as an exploration project to look at Meager, per se, but it's a research program to say, since it's such a well understood area in Canada already because of all the previous work, that it's really the best place to study geothermal systems associated with volcanics. So our goal is to develop these new techniques and tools for imaging in the subsurface to try to better predict permeable zones, but with the goal of taking that new knowledge so that we can extend it to other volcanic belts across Western BC. So that, while Meager is a focus of the study, and certainly Meager economics, we'd love to see a power plant there if it can all work, but it's not necessarily, the goal of the project to see a power plant. That would be a great bonus, but our real goal is to develop techniques that can be exported and used across British Columbia and different volcanic belts across the province.
Yeah, I fully understand that. And obviously there's important goals there. And in terms of, helping to get money to fund research, if there's energy projects developed and there's massive geothermal potential in other parts of the province as well. And I think the two can potentially feed each other.
Yeah.
And 1 year into university, I decided to be an applied scientist, so that's what gets me excited about building things.
Okay, thank you, Ron. And I know, Ron, you mentioned a couple of other people that were on the phone that had been involved in some of these previous projects before. If anybody's on the line that wanted to make any comments there, then feel free before we move on. Okay, so next up, I think the next person with a question was Alan Madsen. Alan, are you able to turn your microphone on and your video on as well?
Yeah, I gotcha. I'm here. Thanks for the talk. It seemed like there was a lot of talk at the start about the importance of finding high permeability rock zones. I just wondered if the locations of thermal hot springs at the surface would be good indicators for where you might find permeable rock zones farther below the surface.
Yeah, it's certainly a good indicator because a hot spring shows that you have deep waters coming up to surface. So it says that you do have a permeable pathway, and this is really one of the reasons why that early work was done at Mount Meager in the first place back in the 70s, because there was a number of hot springs in the area and a volcanic center. So it's a great place to look, but of course we also have to consider too, from an environmental point of view, is that you don't want to produce a geothermal well right beside a hot spring, because you could end up intercepting that hot spring water. And in many cases, these are supporting some unique ecosystems and environments. So we don't want to disrupt a thermal spring system, but we can use that as a kind of a showing where we might want to focus some areas, but it's keeping in mind that any geothermal development, you want to do that ensuring that you're not going to intercept those waters that are forming the hot spring itself.
Cool, awesome, thanks so much.
Thank you for that question, Alan. And I think next up we had Daniel Alonso Torres. Daniel, are you able to ask your question? Okay, hearing nothing from Daniel, we can come back if we need to. But oh.
Excuse me,
Hey,
can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Perfect. I am from Megan's computer. So yeah, my question is very simple. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. That was excellent work, and I'm happy to see that happening. But the question is, do you have any plans for looking at other sites in the Garibaldi volcanic belt, some of which might be closer to Vancouver, such as Mount Cayley or Garibaldi itself?
Yeah, certainly the plans to move it along.
Yeah, I mean, we would love to expand to do some more focused research in other areas along the Garibaldi belt, and that's going to partly just depend on funding availability in the future. But so right now we've kind of used our main envelope of funding for this meager work, and if everything could work out this summer, we can do some wrap-up work, and then we'd have to look at some additional funds if we were to kind of do some more field campaigns in the future. So, but certainly I get that same question from the research team every day. So there's a lot of enthusiasm to now that we've kind of developed our techniques and honed our system here to expand that, and it just makes sense to then go look at some new areas and to see if we can replicate what we've done. So we would love to. We would just have to see what funding opportunities there are for that.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. And then Megan, I think maybe you're with Daniel, but Megan, you had a question too.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks very much for a great talk. So I understand that the different university institutes are gathering their own geophysical data, but is there plans to jointly invert the data together, for example, like a combined MT and gravity inversion?
Yes, yeah. So that's the plan, is that we'll all be combined and integrated together in that. And so right now, yeah, we have different students working on each individual component, but then we're going to work as a group to do that joint inversion and combine all the data together.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Megan. And then the next question was from Juliana Proenza, and I think actually maybe the last question that we have for this afternoon. Juliana, are you online and able to ask your question?
Yes, absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Hi, Steve. Nice to see you virtually, and thank you so much for the update. Really exciting work, and myself, I'm just returning from my maternity leave, and so I'm very excited to see all this flurry of activity happening in the industry. But basically, my question was just kind of a fun, did you find any new evidence of permeability that maybe we hadn't really seen before with the historic data? And what method do you think was maybe best for any of that evidence?
It might be a little too early to fully answer that question. I mean, certainly we see a much better image of the subsurface than we had before with the new data. We're seeing very good signs of potential geothermal reservoirs, and we understand much better now the fracture systems that control permeability, and I think there's a lot of very exciting results coming from some of the remote sensing data. I just gave a little snippet example there, but Johan Chen from our office, who's doing a lot of that work, you're looking at seasonal variations, through summer, winter, fall, and you can really start to see some interesting processes going on there, where you can see these evidence of heat flow along fracture systems, and that's just the surface expression of it, but I think that's going to give us a lot of insight into what's happening in the subsurface that could be quite valuable.
Great, thank you so much.
And I think actually we have a little bit of time, and another question's just popped through from Ted Little. Ted, did you want to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. This is a question that, I mean, I know the answer to it because I'm involved in the program, but I just wanted to ask it just to raise it so that everybody else knew what we were doing. But Steve, have you made any use of machine learning to help augment the analysis of the terabytes of data that you guys are collecting?
There's a great question, Ted. I'll just for clarification, Ted's my boss, so I have to say that. But yeah, no, certainly, we are looking at machine learning techniques and to try to, because it is so much data, right? It's well over 2 terabytes of new data collected, and so we're looking at all these new techniques for artificial intelligence, machine learning, to try and pull out of that data things that maybe we don't see, or just we don't have the human lifespan to spend the time to interrogate it fully, that a computer can do much more rapidly than humans can. So it's really an opportunity to look at applying some of these new modern techniques to manage and to fully interrogate these really large data sets that we're collecting through the study.
Okay, so we're coming up to 4 o'clock, almost time to finish, and I don't see any more questions coming through on the chat. So just before we wrap up, Steve and then Carlos, maybe any kind of closing comments that you wanted to make before we end the meeting?
I was to say thanks everyone for their interest. These things only happen through the support of the local people and everyone else that sees value in this types of research. And please feel free to contact me if you have any more specific questions, or if I can't answer that, I'll route you to the right person in the team who's more knowledgeable in a particular area. But yeah, we want to make sure everyone's aware and of what we're doing, and want to fully share out all the results as they come along. So yeah, contact.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Carlos?
I was just going to say, you can't flip a switch for new power sources. You need to do that, lay down that foundational level of science before you can move forward. So I think this is the kind of work we need to do to ensure that in the future we do have some clean power that we can use here in the Lower Mainland. So we need to do more of this good work, I think. Great job, Steve.
Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed listening to, especially Steve, to your presentation, and great to have so many people taking part. I think between Zoom and YouTube, we've had up to about 95 people watching this afternoon. So thank you to everybody for that. Don't forget that if you miss something, you want to go back and watch something again, the video of this meeting will be available on YouTube either later tonight or tomorrow morning. And we'll also send you a follow-up email as well, which will include Carlos and Steve's presentations and some contact details too, and of course links to all those website pages and things that were mentioned throughout the meeting. So yeah, thank you again. I hope you all have a great evening, and that ends the meeting. I look forward to talking to some of you again before too long. Thank you.